All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 19th, 1974, the West Virginia textbook wars are entering a new period of acrimony, paranoia, and violence. There are so many twists and turns to this story, which is a fight over an attempt to introduce a new set of books into the local public school curriculum in Kanawha County, West Virginia. This is the county that includes Charleston, the capital of West Virginia. I just want to characterize sort of where this story ends up. We'll spend a lot of today's episode talking about how it gets there. But in the end, what we're looking at is 2 men shot and injured on a picket line, an elementary school firebombed, another one dynamited, a school superintendent sprayed with mace and receiving death threats, a group of extremist fundamentalists led by a local reverend who eventually did jail time for a conspiracy to possibly bomb buses full of children heading to school during this boycott. That bombing didn't happen, but school buses were shot at and stoned. Families were chased out of town. It is just an incredible moment, all a result of these very heated wars over local school curriculum that also pulled in all sorts of other cultural and political wars taking place at the time. So here to discuss a really fascinating story, and I think listeners, you will agree, a very resonant story for this moment we're living in right now. Here to discuss that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
This story is wild, wild, wild.
Bananas.
I know we want to get into all the sort of wild outcomes, but let's chart a little bit the beat by beat of how it got to this point. So, either of you can pick it up, but let's just start with basically why is this county basically saying we're going to take a look at our curriculum and try and introduce some new books?
So basically in 1974, the town or the county board of education pitches a new slate of textbooks. And these textbooks are coming from some of the largest textbook companies in the country, and still are. Houghton Mifflin and Macmillan produce a lot of textbooks across the country. And so they had decided that these textbooks were a little bit more modern and they wanted to incorporate them into the curriculum. And they wanted school books that were intended to portray more contributions of minorities and people of color. They range from including people like James Baldwin and his writings, or George Orwell novels, and just had a range of topics that would make, the curriculum a little bit more inclusive, we'll say. Inclusive is a word that we use now, probably not a word they used then. But a lot of people saw this happening, this change, and they were not here for it. And they... that is
to put it mildly.
Not here for it at all. And it starts off with complaints, and then those complaints that spiral into chaos.
And just the reason that there's a look at the curriculum and an introduction of new books, is that because there's a new set of legislation, or is that because the cultural winds are shifting in some particular way? Like, what's our understanding of why this story even starts?
I think it's exactly that. I mean, it's one of the fruits of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This idea, that you saw first on college campuses, that there should be Black studies, that there should be women's studies, that there are all of these people who contributed to the development of the United States whose stories are missing from textbooks. And so they're starting to be included more and more. And there's a push, especially because this particular county includes Charleston, which West Virginia is not a particularly diverse state, but Charleston is more diverse than other parts of the state. And so that Black students in Charleston might have textbooks that reflect a little bit more of their history and their culture is one of the driving forces.
Yeah. There's a quote at the time that basically says that the charge here is that, quote, school books should portray the contributions of minorities to American culture. That seems so, honestly, like pretty bland, right? Yeah, and benign, and harmless. But, that opens the door to, as you were saying, Kellie, introducing new authors, new textbooks. I think part of what I think about in this particular moment is it's a reminder of how quickly the backlash to the civil rights movement happens. We're talking about like 5 years later, people are fed up, and even the notion that let's be a little more expansive in our thinking starts to get wrapped up and radicalized and pushed in, and again, in 2020, that happened in like a matter of months, right? But we see how quickly the backlash happens to any notion of a more expansive way of thinking.
And the backlash is so absurd because it's a response to someone might consider minor concessions. You know what I mean? Like additions to a textbook don't seem like world changing, don't necessarily put food on the table to create jobs or, take dollars out of someone's pocket. But it is what people believed was propaganda, paranoia about this being a slippery slope. But the crazy thing about all this is that in often the cases when you have this kind of hysteria over books, most people aren't even reading the books.
Oh, right.
Right? The
but
books,
it's schools, right? It's kids, right? I mean, indoctrination, what's happening in our schools. We've done a few episodes about this. We did that episode maybe right around the same year, a few years later, about the girl who refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. But like schools are this perfect thing where people feel invested and extremely amped up because it's their kids, but they are just opaque enough that you can convince yourself like there's this secret agenda going on, and you don't actually see what happens day to day in your kid's school, but you have a sense of it. So it's just this, I just feel like schools are this perfect vessel for paranoia and these larger issues that may be swirling in the culture and the politics of the time.
Yeah, and this is a period when backlash politics are happening around schools all over the place. It's this exact same time when in Boston, you have the protest over busing and the school boycotts and the bus boycotts and the violence that breaks out in Boston in 1974. But you also have other backlashes happening at schools. You have backlashes in California over bilingual education. And then you have backlashes here in West Virginia on the same school board about things like sex education, the lack of prayer in schools, and all of this concern about, in the case of Alice Moore, who we'll talk about, of evolution, of teaching Ebonics. There's this. That is one of the things that draws Alice Moore, one of the school board members who helps to organize this protest in West Virginia. She's drawn in by this mix of religious and cultural and racist issues that commingle in almost all of the backlash politics of the 1970s.
Yeah, it's wild. It's the idea that, I don't know how people make these intellectual leaps, but, some of her fears were by the inclusion of adding Black authors that somehow they'd be teaching, quote unquote, to speak in a ghetto dialect. Like the idea that, these books are un-American, or, you saw people with posters that said, I have a Bible, I don't need that dirty book. Like, it's nonsensical, though, how people rationalize their dismissal of the books. But it's also crazy to me just how violent this becomes. Like, it's one thing to issue a complaint, but it's another thing. Next thing you know, like, the Klan's involved. I mean, it's just, it explodes, literally explodes. Yeah. And how these people cannot seem to come to grips with introducing, I can't even say multicultural textbooks, because this is not like the 90s where you get like the decade of multiculturalism and all of that stuff. Like, that's not, this is not Howard Zinn. We haven't even come to that moment just yet of a people's history of the United States. This is still before that, in which the history is still not great. You know what I mean? What they are including is better. It's an improvement, but it's still not good history.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, like, for our purposes, I think in general, telling the story of this, you can sort of say, like, at some point, what's in those actual books just becomes a total non-factor, right? Yeah. As you're describing. Though it's funny, like, James Baldwin actually is always interesting to me, because it's like, I think the most acceptable parts of James Baldwin are probably the books that are being put in here, but there's actually some James Baldwin that might actually get these people a little upset, you know, if they were if they were to actually read James Baldwin. But, you know, again, no one's reading this stuff who's upset about it. People are glomming on these larger fears. So let's talk about that and then get to some of the way that it actually just spirals out of control. I guess, Niki, as you talk a little bit about the larger fears and the sort of rhetoric that accretes here, I think also it's necessary to also point out that there is a larger economic context here too. We're talking early 70s, West Virginia. There is a slow-moving economic depression coming. Industry, you know, coal mines are being shut down. There's people on strike, people losing their jobs. These are all interconnected, and it's just worth pointing out that this fight over textbooks becomes a class war that's tied up in the loss of jobs and all sorts of other things that are going on at the time.
It becomes a way of making cross-class alliances among white people in West Virginia. I mean, look, most of West Virginia is white, but that there had been this deindustrialization and strikes at the mines. You have coal workers, coal miners going on strike in support of the people opposed to the textbooks. And it's partly cultural, right? It's partly because it's their children in those schools. Although we're actually only talking about one county, it becomes a statewide and a nationwide issue. But they also need to show that they have some power in negotiations with the mine operators. And so they're going on strike both to protest the textbooks, but also to show that if they go on strike, it will have an effect on the company's bottom line, which will help them going into negotiations. Those strikes might not be something that white middle-class Midwesterners would support, but they will make common cause with them over the textbook. So it becomes this kind of savvy political move to create an alliance with people who might not otherwise be on their side.
And these alliances get so big in numbers. You know, you have 10,000 miners boycotting. They shut down the city bus so that 11,000 people don't have public transportation. And it effectively shuts down the school. The school has to close for 3 days, remove the controversial books. And then, you know, they call for a group of citizens and parents to review the books. They're trying to sort of restore order, but the protesters just keep ratcheting it up another notch.
Right, because they start with these pretty common protest techniques. They carry picket signs, they go to school board meetings and make a big fuss. Like 1,000 people go to a school board meeting at one point. And there's a boycott at the schools. When schools start in the fall, 20% of the students don't go. Which is very similar to what's happening in Boston with people holding their kids out from the buses. And then it escalates because it becomes part not just of state politics, but of national politics. You start to see the activation of this right-wing conservative organizing that's been happening for decades. And so the John Birch Society gets involved and the Heritage Foundation gets involved and the Klan gets involved. You start to have all of these different groups glomming onto this issue because they see the cultural and political power of it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, though, like how quickly the Klan gets involved, and then this becomes something completely else. Like, there's Nazi insignia that is, put out in school. The school is vandalized. 15 sticks of dynamite are used to bomb the school. A federal grand jury indicted 7 men for conspiring to blow up schools. This one doesn't make sense to me. And radio towers. Like, why blow up the very institution? Like, this is about a textbook. Like, why blow up the school? That doesn't make any sense. Why rob your children? It's like, if we can't have what we want, nobody gets school.
It's so nihilistic. And, one of those bombings that you're talking about, blowing up the bus, the idea was because the kids whose parents were on the right side were boycotting the schools. Mm-hmm. If a kid was on the bus, then the kid was part of the problem. And so you can blow up this bus and you'll only kill the wrong people's kids, right? Or you only kill the right people's kids. And it's so dark, it's so nihilistic, and it is of a piece with the violent opposition to integration, right? Which was as much about attacking children as it was about attacking adults and institutions.
But
and
these
that
are
gives
white kids. These are white kids.
I mean,
not that it matters if they're any other. These are children. Period.
Yeah.
But
it's a big shift to attack white children.
Right. But when you have this larger context and the way that it's morphed into a larger attack on institutions and government, I think all this rational thinking that we've been describing here just goes out the window. And so bombing a school is no longer, I feel like, a tactical step to try and win this particular war. It is more an expression of just, terroristic anger. And, Niki, I think, again, the early 70s is the rise of this anti-government, conspiratorial-minded, race and class melding together, thinking that it's just a strain that we see all the way through to today.
Yeah, I would add religion to that mix too, right? Because this is so much about race. It's also about secularism. It's also led by all of these preachers who are teaming up with members of the Klan. And just as, segregation academies, these Christian schools were places where white people fled integration during the 1960s. Now you have all of those not only coming together in this pretty toxic stew in 1974 in West Virginia, but it's becoming mainstreamed. That's the big change that's happening, is that this isn't just something happening in the South. This isn't just something that's considered fringe, right? It's not the John Birch Society of the early 1960s. Now it's just mainstream conservatism. And there's a group of conservatives who are trying to harness this and use it to build conservative majorities into the 1970s and 1980s, which they succeed at.
But you can draw a straight line from West Virginia to January 6th. The actions, the rhetoric, the vitriol is the exact same.
And I think the political dynamic where leaders feel like they can play a double game, where they can use the language of a movement like this, but somehow still separate themselves from the violent behavior and both support but keep at arm's length. And that's where you get true disaster and true tragedy, is when people don't realize what is actually happening. And that, I think, is another place where it reminds me so much of what's happening now, that this feels like such a slow moving tragedy that I know it's hindsight, but even in real time, I suspect it just, people saw where this was going. This is getting dark. This is people are angry, and maybe it's a small group of people who are angry, but they can do a lot of harm. And I just feel like that's so much of the pit of my stomach gut thing that's happening for me in the last few years and currently, is just seeing, we know where this is headed. This is only going to get darker, right? The temperature doesn't miraculously just drop on its own, right? And this is such a reminder of that.
And even when the temperature does drop, it only drops temporarily, because the end of this story in 1974 is that bringing in the Klan, bringing in these violent terroristic attacks, there are a lot of middle-class white people who are like, actually, I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to do this. I liked the respectability politics that I was playing earlier. And so you do see this decline. The textbooks get okayed. They get brought into the schools, sometimes in libraries. But there's a concession, too, that says parents don't have to let their children read any books that they disagree with morally or politically. And so there's a way that they kind of win the war. They increase the conservatism in these schools, even as they're making changes. But you get these flare-ups again and again. You know, Kellie, you said a straight line to January 6th. There's a straight line to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Yeah. I mean, this happens again and again, where for a brief moment, there is a disqualifying violence, right? But militias continue to grow after 1995. After Charlottesville in 2017, that did not end the violent side of the right. It didn't end racism. It didn't tamp down the support for Donald Trump. So there's a cautionary tale in here, in addition to a story of decline.
Yeah. And it's sort of textbook in terms of like, I'm taking my ball and going home. These communities start their own Christian schools, their own private, Christian charter schools to basically have full autonomy in those schools. Yeah. But that is where you see not just in West Virginia, but all across the country. It's, well, if I have to send my kid to school with this, then I'm going to send them to the private school or to the church school or the Catholic school. Yeah, or homeschool, yeah.
Yeah, and we've been focusing on the violence side of this story, but obviously, like, the textbook war side of the story is super resonant as well now, and we have these fights over critical race theory, and basically everything you don't like gets called critical race theory. There is one sort of added dynamic and dimension to what's happening now in these textbook wars in Texas and other places that I think is interesting, which is, Niki, to your point about like maybe the specific battle and then the larger war. What I see happening, what seems to be happening in Texas, is that a lot of the language is going right to that bigger war. And so it is like, incredibly broad language is being put into these bills under the guise of like out banning critical race theory. Now you have language that basically says like, we can't question America's founding values, right? And so there's, I think, a recognition of the larger game in some of this that is trying to paint immediately with the big brush as opposed to sort of fight the smaller war. I don't know which makes me more despondent, but but it is this remarkable thing where it's now like being taken to such a broad level to try and remake, I think, at a fundamental level, like the kind of language and the kind of sort of understanding of what it means to talk about history in this country.
Well, I think part of it, too, is that there's scholars and journalists who've talked about like the current CRT battles in the public schools are actually not all about CRT. It's more about the election and voting laws and keeping people angry enough so that when they go to the ballot box, they check, accordingly. So that anger motivates people to say, I'm so mad, good vote. I'm going to vote you out. Like, so it's not about curriculum. It's more about control of the local, state, and even national politics.
Yeah. All right. Anything else we want to add to this story? It is full of incredible details. We should shout out. I mean, like, this is one of those stories where, on the one hand, it feels like not covered enough, but on the other hand, there has been some great scholarship and some great reporting about this. I know, actually, in 2010, APM, American Public Media, did a radio series that won a Peabody, and that was right when I was getting my start in radio, and I just remember that coming out and being really inspired by it, and I think I'm going to go back and listen to that documentary series. But there has been some work on this, and if this spurs you to go read and watch and listen, please.
Because the textbook war is ongoing. That is.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. Okay, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
We didn't feel that NEA was in any position to be a negotiator for as far as we was concerned. They're our adversary, because there's nothing here that they're going to be able to solve as far as the people of Kanawha County is concerned. We want our schools back, and we're going to get them back.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.